What software companies don't want you to know about your data security and liability. 8 secrets they keep and the truth you need to know. We're going to cover a few things here today. Number one, 2 types of systems. Do you still own your data if it's stored in the cloud? Will you be able to access the data if you switch software companies? Can a cloud-based company hold your data hostage if you leave? Where is my data safest? Where is the easiest place for a hacker to get your data? Is there a liability if your data is stolen? Will the government really enforce the laws now when it comes to data and HIPAA security? And then what could you do and should you do about data in general? My name is Dr. Brian Capra. I'm the president and co-founder of Genesis Chiropractic Software and Billing Network. Spent 13 years building technology in the cloud. Back 13 years ago, most software companies were not thinking about the cloud or building things in the cloud. We started in the cloud 100% from day one. We have thousands of users now all over the country and in some other countries as well. And one of the unique advantages we've had is because we are a software company and we are also a billing company, we actually are in business with our clients. So if data were to be hacked, we have a major liability when it comes to that as well. So we've always had data security at the top level, top of our mind. One thing to remember here or understand here is the reason I'm doing this video is because there's a lot of misinformation out there. Right now in the news, you're starting to hear a lot about different hackers hacking major networks and data centers and all that, and that's important to realize. So I thought it was really important because there's a lot of information being put out there by other software companies, especially ones that are not in the cloud. And I'm not going to call them liars here, but I think it's just more of a lack of understanding of what some of the benefits or risks. So I'm trying to gather all that for you and put it into something that's easily digestible. All right, so there are basically 2 types of systems, and everybody knows that. There's a client-server type of system, and those are systems that are synonymous with the Platinums and the ChiroTouches out in the world. Client-server, what that means is the server sits in the client's office. So if you're a chiropractor, the server and all the data and the software itself, the license for the software, it actually sits in your practice. So that's basically, so what happens is you get the server, you configure the database, you load the software on that server, then you get all your other computers and you network all of those computers to that server, load all the software again on all those computers, and the data that is entered in those computers is ultimately stored on the server in the office. Now, the second type of system in general that's out there right now is what's called a web-based system or a cloud-based system. So what that means is rather than the server sitting in your office, it sits in the cloud. Think of it as your online banking, or if you use Gmail or any Google Documents or any of those types of systems, everything is in the cloud. It's not stored on your computers or in a server in your office. You're accessing basically the software that sits in the cloud, and you get all the functionality and access to it 24/7 and you have to worry about data backups, and that's a cloud-based system. And there are other cloud-based systems that are starting to come out now. So we're going to talk some about that as well. So that's the 2 basic types of systems, so you understand as I'm mentioning those words what those 2 things mean. So one common misconception that's being put out there sometimes by these other client-server type systems, again, I just don't think, not that they're trying to be misleading, I just don't think they understand it since they're not in the cloud. Client-server software companies have been telling doctors that your data is in the cloud and you don't own your data, which you always own your data. The truth, the actual fact is, whether your data sits in the cloud or it doesn't, as a physician, you own the data. It's just a matter of where it's safest and all these types of things. So let's just get that out of the way right now. You own your data. Will you be able to access your data if you switch software companies? Absolutely. So, there are laws out there to protect you and your access to your data. So any software company that sits in the cloud must store the data for, even if you stop being a client. We have to abide by HIPAA, PHI laws, which is protected health information, and that's the data that's out there for patients. And we actually have to store that by law. So even if you leave as a client and you're not accessing our system anymore necessarily, you absolutely still own that data and you could absolutely access it. So you could imagine if we were to deny a provider access to their data, even if they left as a client, that would create all kinds of legal issues for us. Not to mention, we would never do that, because as soon as a client leaves and they can't access their data, of course, that's going to be all over social media, and we would never, just by that fact alone, we would never risk that. So you absolutely can access your data when you switch software companies. It actually turns out that if you were to switch from let's say a cloud-based system to another system, whether that is another cloud-based system or another client-server-based system, having used a system that is actually in the cloud actually gives you much more reliable access to the data you used to have in the old system. And I'm going to go into more detail regarding that in a little bit here. But if you are going to switch to a cloud-based system, Genesis has been around a long time, like I told you. You also want to be careful that they have a long track record of having a cloud-based system. You want to know about their data security. You want to know about their track record. So, one thing is there are going to be a lot of cloud-based systems that are kind of popping up. So a new company that hasn't been in business with a track record of staying in business, you just want to be a little bit careful about that. Can a cloud-based company hold your data hostage if you leave? Now, this is where I want to talk a little bit about why is it an advantage to have your system in the cloud, even if you switch to another company or another software company, as opposed to having a client-server system. So this is kind of the twist that some of these client-server systems are putting out there, is that you won't have access because your server is not in your office. Again, I already mentioned the PR nightmare that we would have if we ever denied a provider, not to mention the law that says we have to keep the data for you if you ever wanted to access it. But I want you to consider this. If you had a client-server-based system today and you were thinking of switching to another client-server-based system, even forget about the cloud for a second. Let's say you switch from a ChiroTouch to a Platinum. Well, you switch today and years go by and you're using your Platinum system, let's say, and all of a sudden you need the records from your old system. So you have to go back to ChiroTouch. Now your server has been sitting, you'd have to keep that ChiroTouch server with the license and pay for that license sitting in your office somewhere. Even with backing up the data and all that stuff, you have to keep that server in your office. So now you have to go back to that server 5, 6, 7 years later and turn that server on and then hope and have a computer attached to it, because it's not, a server is useless without an actual computer. You have to hope that that software fires up, that data and that server was actually maintained over those years, and then you have to hope that you can get in there. You also have to maintain the license for that, so there's cost just to maintaining that license. And then if it's an old, there's been updates to that software and all that over the years, it could be a problem for you. So you got to hope years and years and years later that you can actually turn that software or that server on and that computer on and get what you need out of it. The alternative is if you switch from a cloud-based system, like for example with Genesis, what we do is we actually give a provider that comes back that needs data, we just grant them access, they log in, it's the same exact software, they don't have to worry about updates or loading software or having a server for all those years. They can just go in, log in, we usually give them like a month of access at a time, and they can go in and get whatever they need and go out. In the meantime, all of that data is stored in a HIPAA compliant data center. We're up to the latest firewall protection and all those things. So your data is not only more accessible, but it's more secure if you had switched from a cloud-based system. So this concept where cloud-based systems are going to keep your data hostage, it's just I'm not saying it's a lie, it's just misinformation, probably from a lack of understanding of how this really works. And then of course you got to consider that as this is going on in the chiropractic market right now, a lot of companies are being purchased up and those softwares are not being supported anymore. So if that actually were to happen and that software is not supported, they don't have a help desk to call, now you're in a situation where you have this old server. If there's any problems, you have no way to get any help to get the data. So you're actually at risk. So the patient could report you to the board and all this stuff. Now, a cloud-based system, even if we were purchased tomorrow, whatever company would have purchased us would need to actually abide by the law, which means they have to keep access to the data. So Genesis is not in the place where we need to sell our software. You see a lot of that happening right now, but we're continuing to grow, and we're actually way more competitive than these other companies. They're buying up other softwares for a reason, and we're not on that radar. So keep that in mind as you're listening to other software companies. If you're looking for a new software, where is can they hold it? It cannot be held hostage in any way, shape, or form. It wouldn't even be legal. So where is your data actually the safest? Again, we're talking, is it safer on a server in your office, or is it safer in the cloud? Now, you would think that if where's a hacker going to actually go to get this stuff? Well, you would think that if you were a hacker, that you're going to go to the biggest data center and try to hack the data center. Because that's where the most data is, and PHI, protected health information, is some of the most valuable data in the world, right? So that's very valuable. Hackers are going to want to get it. So, where are they going to go get it? You'd think they'd go to you'd think they would go to the big data center, but the truth is, the correct answer is they're really going to go to the easiest place they can get it. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So where is the easiest place for a hacker to get your data? So as you know, Genesis is a cloud-based system, and our data is actually stored in a HIPAA-compliant data center. HIPAA-compliant data center, quote-unquote, air quotes, means a whole lot of things. There has to be super high-level security level, so you can't get into that building without biometric scanning. In that data center, there's 24/7 security. If there's a disaster, God forbid, we actually had Hurricane Sandy roll right over our data center, and we never lost any downtime. The reason for that is the HIPAA-compliant data centers have power backup. So if the data center power on the grid goes down, they actually have diesel generators that kick in, start to power the data center. And those diesel generators, as far as in a national disaster, if there's fuel distribution, they are the first tier 1 place that gets diesel fuel. So they will make sure all the data centers have all the diesel fuel they need before they bring any fuel to a gas station even. So the power of a HIPAA-compliant data center is that there's 24/7 security. Every keystroke that you make, so the connection between your office and our data center, what that means is that every keystroke is encrypted with banking level encryption. So the highest level of encryption, and if a year or two from now the encryption requirements go up or change, we are going to be on top of that. Obviously, it's our business and we have to abide by law. So those things are going to actually keep that data the most secure. So if I'm a hacker, it's the most difficult place to go get data if I wanted to go and get data. So basically these data centers are like Fort Knox for data. So now we need to think about one doctor's office with a server in their office, right, as opposed to a cloud-based system that has the latest firewalls, the most encryption, the most secure data center, right? So we're talking about now it's in your office. So all those computers have to be networked to each other. Most times there's computers that are also connected to the internet. And so what happens is that little network where you don't necessarily keep up with firewalls and the latest in technology and all that, because this stuff changes so frequently, that's the easiest place for a hacker to go in and actually get data. It may not be the mother lode, but it's easier to go to one little practice, another little practice, another little practice, and go and grab some data. And the other thing is a lot of these client server-based systems, they have, they tout online intake forms and all this stuff, which is great, and we have a lot of that stuff too. But what happens when it's a client server-based system is that actually leaves a big hole in the network, so that it actually becomes easier for even easier for a hacker to go in and access those online connections to your system and actually go through and hack your data. So we actually have a HIPAA compliant portal, so it's a secure portal for a patient to get documents or fill out documents. Another thing to consider is that the software company, let's say client server system, they find a vulnerability. If they found the vulnerability in their software and they found a hole, let's say, and they needed to update the software to protect that, they'd have to roll out or distribute the update to potentially thousands of practices. And you're practicing and you see there's an update, but you don't necessarily realize that this is putting your entire career at risk, because we'll go into some of the liabilities here in a minute. So that they're not necessarily going to be able to roll out that update instantaneously, as opposed to a cloud-based system where if we found a vulnerability, it's updated, fixed, and you instantly get it without having to download software onto all the computers and the server and all that stuff. So bottom line is the easiest place for a hacker to get data is at the single practice provider with a client server system, not in the cloud with all the encryption. If they don't have to hack through all that stuff, why not just go through and hack a single practice? Is there liability if your data is stolen? This is a really important topic. This is where we kind of are getting to the meat of this, and what really matters is, what is your liability? If they did hack your office with a client server system, what does it mean? And what if they did hack Genesis data center? Could happen. It takes a lot of work, but it could happen. So where is your liability is really the most important question. So if you're using a client server based system as opposed to a cloud-based system like Genesis, if your data is stolen because of negligence, and negligence could simply mean you didn't update your firewall or your network security for some amount of time, and that new hole in your security meant somebody could go in and hack your data, that is 100% your liability. Now, you're a provider, you're a doctor. This is not your job. This is not what you should be thinking about or worried about when you go to bed at night. This is not your expertise. So if your data is stolen, and I'm going to go into what the actual fines are for this, which you'll be really surprised at, the liability is 100% yours. The software company that provided you this, it's not their liability. Even if they had some liability, you can bet they're going to have some level of insurance that's going to protect them from claims for this type of thing. So they'll never feel it. They'll keep on going in business. The liability will fall directly, squarely in your lap. Now, on the other hand, using a cloud-based system, I can speak for at least Genesis. Again, HIPAA compliant data center, everything is compliant. We definitely have all the insurances against hacking and all that stuff. But let's say you're practicing, you're using Genesis, your data is being stored, and they did hack Genesis data center, God forbid. Because you outsourced that to a company, and we had the latest, highest level, most technologically advanced data security, it's no longer your liability. By the way, you should always have insurance against this stuff. It doesn't hurt to have it. But it would be our liability. And of course, we have the insurance against that stuff. So you're basically not only outsourcing your data backup and storage and all that stuff, but you're also outsourcing and removing the liability. Now, you should always also, by the way, disclaimer here, you should always consult with a professional and make sure that your networks are internally up to date on a consistent basis. But since your patient data is not stored in your practice, your liability is an exposure. It's much, much, much less. So let's talk a little bit about what the actual fines are for this, and then we're going to talk about whether or not these things are actually enforced. And so the fines are considerable. So remember, each patient record that is compromised, even if they haven't been in your office in several years, it's a patient record. So that counts for one occurrence. All right, so imagine one patient record, somebody hacked and they only took one patient record. That's one occurrence. So it's also per occurrence for every year you had that. So now you have one patient that you've had in your system for 1, 2, 3 years. If it's 3 years, it's 3 occurrences. One patient, it's per patient per year. All right, so you got to remember that. All right, so the minimum fine is $100 and the maximum fine is $50,000 for every violation or occurrence. So for every covered entity, and you would be a covered entity, category 1, I'm going to read this for you. A violation that the covered entity was unaware of and could not have realistically avoided had a reasonable amount of care been taken to abide by the HIPAA rules. So it's reasonable to think that you should have your firewalls protected, up to date, and you should have your data secure. Maybe even having a client-server based system when there are better systems out there, more secure systems, that could be even number one just by default, that every violation or every occurrence would be at least a Category 1 violation. So Category 1. Category 2, a violation that the covered entity should have been aware of but could not have avoided even with reasonable amount of care. Category 3, a violation suffered as a direct result of willful neglect of HIPAA rules in case where an attempt has been made to correct the violation. Category 4, a violation of HIPAA rules constituting willful neglect, where no attempt has been made to correct the violation. Now, it really depends on if there's a violation or an occurrence and how you're being prosecuted, basically. But you can see Category 4, this is the highest level per violation. A violation, again, I'm going to read again, Category 4, a violation of HIPAA rules constituting willful neglect where no attempt has been made to correct the violation. So as the environment changes for data security, they're going to start holding people more and more accountable. So as people start to become more aware that having your data in the cloud is the safest way to store your data, even though anybody can get hacked, it could be viewed as willful neglect. That's the key word here. You know about something that could have been done, that could have been better, and you just neglected to do it. All right? So it's Category 1 all the way up to the most severe Category 4. Whatever category you wind up falling in, if this happens to you, it basically goes from the least to the most, and the least basically on your level of neglect. What you knew you could have done and what you actually did to protect this patient's data. Okay, so that's the categories. So let's talk about the fines per category. So Category 1 goes from a minimum of $100 per occurrence and up to $50,000. So if you have Category 1, the least level, your data is hacked and somebody actually prosecutes. So you have one patient file for 3 years, that's 3 occurrences. The minimum fine is $100, so you have $300 for one patient over 3 years. Not going to put you out of business. The maximum fine for Category 1 is $50,000. So they can take anywhere in between from $100 per occurrence. So if it's $50,000 for that one patient over 3 years, it's a $150,000 fine. So Category 2 is between $1,000 and $50,000. Category 3 is between $10,000 and $50,000. And Category 4 is a minimum of $50,000 per violation, and it could go up from there. So any level of violation, any level of neglect where a patient's file is stolen and you should have known, and it's 100% on you to know what your liability is and what you could have done about it, anywhere in between there, and obviously you have more than one patient over 3 years, any one of these could put you out of business, for sure. So you just need to understand this is not something you should be taking lightly. Potential jail time. Tier 1, reasonable cause or knowledge of violation, up to 1 year in jail. Tier 2, obtaining PHI, protected health information, under false pretenses. This is if you're actually hacking. Up to 5 years in jail. Obtaining PHI for personal gain or with malicious intent, up to 10 years in jail. So you're probably not going to wind up with jail time unless you're really willfully trying to sell the data or something like that, or hack somebody's system. But the biggest thing is the fines. Category 1 through 4, you could potentially be put out of business with any one of those levels of fines. Will the government ever really enforce this? This is a really important topic. Whatever level of enforcement they're doing today, you can bet it's going to increase. You know what's going on with all these companies, big companies, Yahoo and all these companies getting hacked. So they're going to start to ramp up the enforcement. But there is a big misconception out there. When HIPAA started, back in the day, it was just kind of a thing and they weren't really enforcing it. Well, the enforcement even has actually turned up quite a bit. Now, if you're thinking of the government and how they could generate more revenue, especially with the Obama administration, who better to recoup a whole bunch of money from to put into the government than rich doctors, right? So think of it just from a pragmatic standpoint. But the Obama administration actually decided to hire private parties to find these violations. So the HIPAA mercenaries, you can call them, are actually paid a percentage of the penalty received by the government. So obviously the government doesn't have the manpower to go into chiropractors' offices or physicians' offices and look for HIPAA violations and then prosecute. So actually what the Obama administration did, which was, from a business standpoint, actually smart, they decided to outsource this, find mercenaries basically that would go out and find practices that were violating. So just by Obama, they actually ramped this up. So they pay a percentage. So if you're $50,000 fine times however many patients times however many years you've had those files, if it's $1 million, these people get paid. So they're paid to find the biggest problem possible and magnify the problem, not to make it small. The tiers and the categories were signed into law 2009 by President Obama himself as part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. It's the same one that put the Medicare reimbursement when you bought a certified system. Same act actually also put into place the ability to recoup these monies for HIPAA violations. It's actually the first act President Obama signed. So the fines are substantial, even with the minimal offense, because it's per occurrence, per patient, per year you have the file. The negligence, is an ambiguous term, and just because you don't keep up with the things like firewalls and a client server system and all that stuff, which not your job, but it is your responsibility, that could easily, probably most practices, if you go into that have a client server based system right now, if they got hacked, it would wind up potentially putting them out of business. So these are the things you really need to be aware of. So I hope this has dispelled some of the myths that are out there, and also shine some light on what the real liability is for you and where your data is actually most secure. So, and basically in summary, do you own your data? If it is in the cloud, of course you do, always. Do you have access to the data in the cloud? Always. Is your data safer in the cloud or at a client server-based system? It's obviously much safer in the cloud for all the reasons, the liability and the everything we spoke about. Do you have liability in the cloud? Much less, if not none. So I don't want to say none, disclaimer, but your liability by outsourcing this basically is much less if your server and your data is in the cloud. What should you do? What you definitely should do is, regardless if you're in the cloud or have a client server system, you should have an expert, HIPAA compliant expert, come in, look at your practice, give you a report of where your weaknesses are, and absolutely put a plan in place to start to correct those. That would go a long way if, for God forbid, you have a client server system, even if you switch to the cloud and something happens in the future and you had this basically report and the steps you needed to improve and you took those steps, you're going to wind up in a much better place. So definitely go hire a company and put that in place. Obviously biased here, but you should for sure move to the cloud regardless. The other thing you should do is have some level of insurance for your data and your data security in your office. God forbid something goes down and you need to fight a legal battle. There are actually more and more insurance companies that have policies for this. So consult an insurance company about these types of things, business liability insurance. So, again, I'm not an attorney. I'm a doctor that has been building cloud-based software for 13 years or so. We take this very seriously. Obviously, it's our neck on the line as well. We want to keep our client servers and data as secure as possible. It's something we do on a regular basis, on a daily basis, is make sure we have the latest encryption and all that. So I hope this shines some light on the topic for you, and If you have any questions, you can always email me, Dr. Brian, DRBRIAN, at genesischiropracticsoftware.com.